Good morning to everyone. Welcome to the first event of the online distinguished series with Professor Joshua Greene. This is being organized by the Center for Neural and Cognitive Sciences, University of Hyderabad. Thanks to all the participants joining from India, specifically for joining in relatively early in the morning. Special thanks to Professor Greene for joining us quite late into the night, that on a Sunday. It's 11:30 p.m. in Boston right now, so thank you. We really appreciate it. I also welcome Professor Ramesh Mishra, Department Chair at Center for Neural and Cognitive Sciences as a panelist. I am Seema Prasad, a final year PhD student at CNCS and the student coordinator for this particular session. Let me begin by introducing our panelists. Joshua Greene is a professor of psychology at Harvard University. He is a recipient of the Stanton Prize, which is an award given by the Society for Philosophy and Psychology for significant contributions to interdisciplinary research. His research interests lie at the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy. What this means is that he turns interesting thought experiments in philosophy to actual scientific experiments. Using this approach for more than 20 years, he and his group have been working on understanding moral judgment and trying to answer questions like, do we make moral decisions based on our intuitive gut reactions or through more deliberate thinking? Which one's better, under what circumstances, and how studying all of this can possibly reduce conflict between people with different moral values. A lot of these ideas are included in a book he wrote a few years ago called Moral Tribes, Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them. More recently, he has been interested in higher level cognition and what he refers to as brain's infrastructure for complex thought, which primarily deals with how we generate and understand complex ideas. Joining him today is Professor Ramesh Mishra. He is a fellow of the Psychonomic Society and one of the founding editors of the Journal for Cultural Cognitive Science. In his research, he has used bilingualism as a model to understand how our brains sort out conflict using both behavioral and eye tracking tools. His most recent book is called Bilingualism and Cognitive Control, which provides a state-of-the-art coverage on the issues of cognitive consequences of bilingualism from an evolutionary, neuroscientific, and psychological perspective, along with the various controversies that exist on this topic. More recently, he has been interested in attentional control and its dependence or the lack of it on conscious awareness. Some housekeeping stuff before we begin with Professor Greene's talk. All of you are in a listen-only mode, which means that you can hear and see us, but we cannot hear you or see you. A few words about the format. Professor Greene will first give a talk about his work, which will be followed by a conversation with Professor Mishra, touching upon some of the main threads of his talk. Then we will start taking in the questions. You are encouraged to start thinking about the questions as the talk begins, and you don't have to wait till we start the Q&A session. You should see a Q&A tab somewhere on your screen, and you can type in your question whenever you think of it. We will just take them all together from the top when we do start the Q&A session. And if we cannot accommodate all the questions, please feel free to write an email to Professor Greene with your question. Since this is the first talk of the online series that we've started, I asked Professor Mishra to talk a bit about why we're doing this and what the participants can hope to gain from these series of talks.
Well, thank you, Seema, for basically organizing this and getting somebody of the stature of Professor Greene to this fora. And I'm very happy that we could continue this in the new format, the new normal format. We were doing Talk, inviting a lot of people earlier when things were okay. So this is the first one in the webinar format, and this allows us new freedom as well, because you don't have to travel, and you can do this from the comfort of your home, and a lot more people can join in, which is the case here. I'm very happy. 100 people have just signed up, and this is very nice news. So Talk is basically an interdisciplinary fora, because in India, this science is kind of growing for the last 10, 15 years, and I have been active in this science ever since I was an assistant professor. So I basically have been teaching cognitive science since my first day on the job. So I have seen this field grow, and cognitive science has spread tentacles to other fields in India, and a lot more people are coming in. We have many IITs and other universities that have started this courses. So one of the main aims is to touch upon new issues, inviting people that have more multidisciplinary interests and all kinds of discussions, so that the younger generation or even the more established scholars can find new cues to research. And now we are talking in a very different scenario, because we don't know what will happen to a lot of stuff in coming times, higher education, conferences, etc. But so that's the basic introduction to Cog Talk, and its format can change. Sometimes people prefer to give a full lecture followed by Q&A, but sometimes it can be a little bit of discussion followed by Q&A. So we are kind of flexible. And when this goes to YouTube, I encourage the audience to comment if they would like to see a bit of a change. That's okay with us. We will try to modify. So now coming to Professor Greene, as I have said that we are very pleased to have a very distinguished scholar from cognitive science, and who is speaking to us today, and he quickly agreed, given the circumstances. We are really, really thankful, Professor Greene, for your time at this hour. In it's pretty late in night in US, and his introduction can be very lengthy, and I would like to keep it short. First of all, Professor Greene is known probably more for his fundamental work in the area of moral cognition, or neuromorality, and this probably has started long before. His graduate student days at Princeton, and his maybe a background of philosophy at Harvard when he was an undergraduate, and then later forays into cognitive neuroscience as a postdoctoral scientist, and then joining Harvard back, and then carrying on that track of work. But what the audience would like, or probably would find interesting, a lot of kind of people from different fields, is this fine blending of philosophical questions, because morality is primarily a metaphysical question, and it's pretty ancient. It's not a new question. It's a very ancient question, but the approaches that he has taken, there are many other scholars who have been working in this area, are not new. It's a bit reductionism, but also it has kept that touch of abstractness, subjectivity in it. And Professor Greene, in his book, a very popular book, and many reviews of it. I just read a couple of by John Gray in Independent, and there are various. These reviews have been written from various perspectives. That's okay, but it's a widely accepted book, and I encourage people to go and have a look at it. Moral tribes. So the question is very, very important nowadays. It is more important than what do we care most, whether individual happiness or collective happiness. It might differ for different countries, different cultures, and whatever it is. So I think I would like to throw some ideas, because it's an interdisciplinary idea, and there are lots of researches going on in using different models on this question. So he's best known for his dual mode theory, or the theory that he would like to speak more about that, which has a connection to Dan Kahneman's notions of automaticity and more regulated versus of cognitive control. And that is attractive to me personally, because I have been working on this kind of research for a long time, albeit in the area of bilingualism and attention control using different methods. So there is an interesting interface here. And Professor Greene probably recently has turned his interest to language. I just saw a massive review in annual reviews on compositionality and language, bringing further back. Maybe you would like to speak a bit on that, because it's obviously an interesting area, but it's so clearly he's multidisciplinary. So that makes him, and the audience should know that he has won awards for his teaching at Harvard. So he has been acknowledged for his teaching at Harvard, and also that book that has been well received, and many YouTube lectures. I request the audience to look at the many longest YouTube lectures, with not just with Pinker, with Dennett, and there are many where he has been actively participating much before it all became online for us. So these videos should be helpful after we go through this talk and the Q&A for anything that is missing. So with that, I think I again welcome you to India in this in this sense, it's kind of, and we would have loved to maybe when things become okay, we will like to have you back in India, because India is a kind of diverse country, and it remains a challenging country for a number of reasons, for theoreticians and scholars. So I think we should start and request Professor Greene to deliver his talk as he wishes, using the PowerPoint or as he likes. And then I'll be back with a bit of discussions on some questions that might come up, and then the audience will have their time for a Q&A. So Professor Greene, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much for your extremely generous introduction. I just want to make sure, can you hear me okay? Everything's working? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, thank you. This is great. I don't know if I would have been able to travel all the way to India, but one of the nice things about our current situation, there are so many things that are not very nice, is that it makes it easier for people to connect who are farther away, or at least it's more likely to have events like this. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and maybe getting some questions from people who are listening. So thank you so much for your generous introduction and for inviting me. It is a great honor and a great pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So I'm gonna get with some slides here. Let's see. And again, let me just check. You see the title slide, okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So as Professor Mishra said, I'm interested in kind of the philosophical aspects of the science of the human mind, and interested in the kinds of things that make us uniquely human. The things that you really couldn't study or couldn't completely study if you only had animal models and you couldn't look directly at people. And one puzzle, let me see, I'm having a hard time getting my slides to advance. Let's see. There we go. A puzzle about humans, and when you look at our nearest living relatives, is that in a certain sense we look a lot like other primates, other apes. But if you look at our brains, take the brain of a human and the brain of a chimpanzee, the human brain looks bigger. But the human brain really looks pretty much like a scaled up chimpanzee brain. And so you might think, oh, well, these species are very similar. But of course, we know that humans can do things like this, where we not only express ourselves with facial expressions and engage in some hunting in small groups and things like that. We're able to build cities like Boston or Hyderabad, if I'm pronouncing that. And how is it that just a modified chimpanzee essentially is capable of behaving and living in such fundamentally different ways? Now, one hypothesis could be that, well, we just have these bigger brains, and those bigger brains just make us generally smarter. If our brains weigh 3 times as much, then we just have 3 times the intelligence. But I think the story is more complicated than that, and I'm going to attempt to show a video that gives a sense for that complexity. So give me a thumbs up if you can see and hear this when I play it. Let's see. So I think a lot of people find this pretty surprising, that if you give a chimpanzee a kind of test, that's the kind of test that we humans use to measure how intelligent different people are, the chimp can do as well or better than the humans, that it's not just simply a matter that our brains work better, right? So then the question is, well, if it's not just merely about having generally smarter, generally bigger brains, then what is the secret to our ability to build cities as opposed to just live in small hunter-gatherer bands? So Charles Darwin speculated about what it is that might make us so special. And here he's talking about social instincts, but you might think about this as being, or conscience, but really about human intelligence more generally. He says, the following proposition seems to me in a high degree probable, namely that any animal whatsoever endowed with well-marked social instincts would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well developed or nearly as well developed as in man. So essentially what Darwin is saying is that there are really two things that are special about us. We have these social instincts, which are similar to those that we have that our nearest living relatives like chimpanzees might have. But then we have these other intellectual powers. And when you combine those intellectual powers with human or primate social instincts, then you get new things that the planet has never seen before. And this sort of tracks the sort of two strands of research going on in my lab right now. One are about our social side, and in particular our intuitions and the way they enable us to cooperate. And then on the other side, special features of human intelligence. So if you look at this list of words, so you see guilt, gratitude, embarrassment, friendship, compassion, forgiveness, you might look at these and think, okay, well, this is just a random list of things that humans might experience as part of their social lives. But what I'm going to argue is that these things are actually very specific cognitive devices. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story about how I think it all fits together. It's a story that many of you may already know. So this is the classic story of the tragedy of the commons as told by the ecologist Garrett Hardin. So here we have these herders who live on this pasture, and these herders are rational and self-interested, and they every now and then they have to ask a question: should I add more animals to my herd? And they think, well, if I add more animals, then I have more sheep when I take them to market, so that's good. What's the cost? Well, they're just grazing on this common pasture, so they think, okay, I'll add more animals to my herd. But then they all add so many animals that the pasture can't support any of the animals, and all of the animals die, and everybody ends up being worse off. Well, this is the famous tragedy of the commons, and it illustrates the basic problem of social life, the basic conflict between self-interest and collective interest, or you might say between me and us. And the problem is that if everybody just does what's in their individual best interest, then everybody ends up being worse off. So the real question of social life is, how do you get people to not just think about me, but to also think about us, or at least to think about to some other people? So a few years ago, with David Rand and Martin Novak, we started doing some cognitive experiments to try to answer some basic questions about how human cooperation works. And our test bed for this is something known as the public goods game. So the way the public goods game works is people come into the lab, or they do this in a virtual lab online. Everybody's given a certain amount of money, so say $10. Everybody you can, as a player in this game, you can keep all of your money, or you can give some or all of your money to the common pool. And anything that goes into the common pool gets doubled by the experimenters, and then it gets divided equally among all of the players. So let's say there are four players. And if you do the math, what you realize is that no matter what the other people do, if you're only doing this once, which is how we do this, you come out ahead if you choose to keep your money. So the me thing to do is to keep your money, but the us thing to do is to put all of your money into the common pool, because that maximizes the amount that gets doubled and then divided among everybody. So there's the selfish thing to do, and there's the cooperative thing to do. And what we wanted to know is, when people are cooperative, are they cooperative in an intuitive kind of way? That is, where they just are sort of following an intuition, a gut feeling, or are they really sort of, is it maybe a abstract voice of conscience that's saying, no, you should be good to the other people and not, follow your immediate selfish impulse or something like that? And so we did a very simple experiment. We had people make decisions about what to do in this public goods game under different conditions. So in one condition, they were unconstrained. So they didn't, in terms of how long they took. And in this particular case, it was about 60%, people on average gave about 60% of the money that they had. In another condition, we said, you have to decide in less than 10 seconds. So here the goal is to get an intuitive kind of response. And what we found is that when we put people under time pressure and made them respond quickly, they gave more money. So this is consistent with the idea that it's a kind of intuitive response that's making people be cooperative. And consistent with that, when we told people you have to take at least 10 seconds to answer. So you've got to slow down and think about this. Under those conditions, people ended up giving less. Now, I should say that you don't see this all the time everywhere. This is a pattern that we see in some places some of the time. And I think that's important. That is, it's not that people are universally cooperative with everybody, but what we do find is that when people are cooperative, when people are nice, it tends to be driven by an intuitive kind of response. But to illustrate some of the variability, I'll tell you about a different version of this that we did. We're just looking at people's reaction times and how much they gave. In this version of the experiment, we asked people, do you trust the people that you interact with in your daily life? And then we divided people into two groups. Some people said they do trust people and other people said they don't. If you look at the people who said, yeah, I trust the people I interact with, for those people, we saw a similar kind of effect. That is, when people responded quickly, they gave more money. And when people responded slowly, they gave less, right? So again, the idea is that the nice behavior, the cooperative behavior, the us behavior is fast, but it's when people think more slowly, they're more selfish. When you looked at the people who said that they don't trust the people that they interacted with, we didn't see a statistical difference between their reaction times for these things. That is, you can think of it this way. The people, if you don't trust the people around you, your first thought is you're keeping your money. And your second thought is you're keeping your money. And as a result, it doesn't matter if you go fast or if you go slow. Now, these experiments here suggesting that it's a kind of intuitive response that makes us pro-social is really just one tiny example of a much larger set of research projects showing that our social behavior is largely driven by emotional responses, especially when it comes to being cooperative. And the way I like to break it up is I think of it as a sort of a 2x2 here. That is, we have positive feelings and we have negative feelings, and they can be applied to ourselves and they can be applied to other people. So we have positive feelings that make us cooperative with others. So if I care about the other herders on the pasture, I love them or they're my friends, I trust them, I care about their well-being, then that's going to make me be a cooperative herder, and I'm not going to eat up the whole pasture just for myself. I also might feel guilty or embarrassed or afraid if I were to eat up the whole pasture and leave not enough for everybody else. So that's negative feelings that are making me want to be cooperative. And then there are positive feelings that make us cooperative towards other people. So you will have my gratitude if you're a nice cooperative person. And if you're not cooperative, then I'll be angry with you, or maybe even I'll be disgusted with you, right? So all of these different feelings that may seem like they're unrelated are actually different strategies, different ways of getting us to be cooperative. And so this covers, I think, the well-marked social instincts part of this. And maybe if you want in discussion, we can talk about how more recent experiments that we've been doing where we've been trying to sort of get people to either through reasoning or with intuition make more pro-social behavior. But I'll leave that for later discussion. I want to now just briefly introduce this idea of the intellectual powers, the other side of this research program. What is it about our thinking that enables us to do things that other animals can't do? Okay, so here's a sentence you probably haven't seen before. Yesterday, I was serenaded by 4 pink elephants. So if you haven't seen this sentence, even though it's a weird sentence, you immediately understood that this refers to something like this, right? So how did you do that? I mean, in a sense, there's nothing very remarkable going on here. You read a sentence that you hadn't seen before and you understood what it meant and you were able to picture something in your mind, right? But this is actually really a remarkable ability. And as from a neuroscientific perspective, we really don't know how you get a bunch of brain cells to take a bunch of concepts and quickly put them together. So let's think about what this requires just to understand this sentence. You have to understand what yesterday means and what me is, or what I refers to, and what singing or serenading is, and what 4 is, and what pink is, and what elephant is. You have all of these different concepts, and you immediately put them together in just the right way so that you get the right idea. And I don't think this would work simply by making guesses based on the statistics of what you've experienced before. you've experienced elephants, perhaps, if not personally, then in movies or in zoos, and you've had singing, but it's probably not the elephants that are doing the singing in your experience. And yet, when you read this sentence, you know exactly how to put those things together. So how do we combine meanings like that and do it so flexibly? So this line of research started with a fantastic student who's now a postdoc at Princeton named Stephen Franklin. And we started doing experiments with the most simple, complex meanings that you can come up with. That is complex in the sense that the meaning of the sentence has parts that can be mixed and matched and rearranged. So we use simple sentences like the car hit the truck or the truck hit the car. And what we want to know is where in the brain do we see a different response and a different pattern of activity depending on whether the sentence is the truck hit the car or the car hit the truck. And because we want it to be about the meaning of the sentence and not the sound or the order of the words, we also use sentences like the car was hit by the truck and the truck was hit by the car. And the idea is that we're looking for the same pattern for the truck hit the car as for the car was hit by the truck, because those mean the same things. And then a different pattern for the opposite meaning, right? So when we looked around the brain to see what was tracking the differences between sentences that use the same concepts but put them together in different ways, we found this region in the left mid superior temporal cortex, and also extending into parts of the parietal lobe, where it's not just about which concepts are being activated, but about how they're put together. And that was, to us, was interesting. But of course, we know that somewhere in the brain, that difference has to be registered because you understand the difference. So our next move was to try to understand, ultimately we want to understand how does the brain do this. But to link this back to questions about morality and first sort of verify that this region really is doing something related to meaning, we did something else. So we used sentences that have different emotional meaning. So take grandfather or baby kicks grandfather, which is cute. Grandfather kicks baby, that is not very cute. And as you would expect, if you know something about emotional responses in the brain, we see more of a response in the amygdala when people read the sentence describing the nasty behavior, right? And this is, I won't get into the details, but we'll just call this an emotional response in a place where we would expect to see it. And then we look at that same part of the brain before, where we saw the difference between the truck hit the car and the car hit the truck. And the question is, does the pattern of activity in this region that we think is representing the meaning, does it relate to the emotional response in the way that we'd expect? And that is what we found that it does. So when the pattern in the meaning region is more clear, you see more of an emotional response in the emotion region. So this suggests that we're getting at the right thing. But I think the most interesting finding comes from saying, well, all right, we have this region where there's this difference in meaning, but how does it do that? We looked around this region and said, well, is there a place where we can figure out, we can look at the pattern of brain activity and tell who did something? So if it's the dog chased the cat, can we see a pattern that tells us that it's dog rather than cat? And then we look around also and ask, is there a place where we can decode what was the action? So what kind of action was done? And is there a place where we can decode the patient? That is, this is just a technical linguistic term for the thing that had something done to it. And what we found was really striking. So within this region that I show you here in yellow, we found these two other little regions right next to each other. One where you can decode better than chance who the agent is. That's the one I'm showing in blue. And then another region where you can decode better than chance who the patient is. That is the thing that had something done to it. So if it's the dog chased the cat, then we would see a pattern that reflects dog in the blue region and a pattern that reflects cat in the red region. And if it's the cat chases the dog, then we'd see a pattern that reflects cat in the blue region and a pattern that represents dog in the red region, right? And so this was kind of a surprising finding if you think about it from the sort of history of neuroscience, because in neuroscience, what we generally find is that there are different cells or clusters of cells that represent specific things, like types of things, like a dog or a cat or scenes or faces. But this is representing something that is playing a role in meaning, the thing that does something. And then the value of that thing gets put in there. So it's like, if you want to represent the dog chase the cat or the truck hit the car, then you can put truck hits car. And then if you want to represent the opposite, then it's car hits truck. And the advantage of having this way of doing things is that it's more like a computer program. So if you were going to write a little computer program, let's say, that translates Celsius to Fahrenheit, you could make a very big table with all of the temperatures in Celsius and all of the temperatures in Fahrenheit, and then just have the program look up in the table what's there. But a more elegant way to do it would be to have a mathematical formula with variables in it, where you plug in the Celsius temperature, you do some multiplication and some addition or subtraction, and then you get the Fahrenheit temperature. And then you can do that for anything, right? But the key is having those variables where you can put in new values and get new outputs. And the idea here, and this is following ideas, I should say, from Gary Marcus in his wonderful book, The Algebraic Mind. The idea here is that the brain is functioning like this kind of computer program where it has a formula, something did something to something else. And then you can quickly put in the values of different things and get an idea. And then the idea about this way of working is that the way that our brains can quickly generate new ideas that it's never encountered before is by having this system, having these formulas already set up. And then you can put the right concepts in the right places and get a precise meaning out of it. Okay, so we found this one region that can represent the difference between dog chase cat, cat chase dog, car hits truck, truck hits car, and does it in this formulaic, sort of classical computer-like way. But it also seems like this can't be the only way that the brain represents things like this. So here, we have the dog chases the woman or the woman chases the dog, and you can imagine these things as looking like this. But now what if we say the woman climbs the rock face? Well, in both of these cases, these last two, the woman is the agent, right? And as far as the computer program way of representing these things are concerned, it's just the concept woman. But if you're going to imagine a woman chasing a dog or imagine a woman climbing something, you need to imagine the woman differently. Here you need to imagine, in the first case, you need to imagine the woman, running, striding. In the other case, you imagine the woman with her arms up, pulling herself. And there needs to be some place in your brain that can take those words and then turn it into something that you can picture, right? And you're going to have to picture it differently depending on how these concepts naturally relate to each other. And so what we did in this next experiment is we said, well, is there any place in the brain that is representing these more relational units, like woman chases or woman climbs or woman is chased or something like that, right? So in the interest of, I'll say one way to think about this is, if you're going to you can represent these concepts as playing a very abstract role, like the thing that's doing something, but you can also have these more concrete relationships, like woman as chaser or dog as the thing that's doing the chasing. And what we found when we looked around the brain for reusable units like woman chases or dog chases, we found this part of the brain in the medial prefrontal cortex that represents those larger units in a reusable kind of way. And the way we think about this is that it's kind of like clip art. Like if you were going to construct, if I said, okay, I want you to make a presentation and I want you to show me an image of a woman climbing something that she wouldn't normally climb, I don't know, the outside of a building. Maybe you can find a picture of that, but maybe what you have to do is take a picture of a woman climbing in a building and then put those things together, right? And so the idea is that there's got to be something in your brain that can just move symbols around, but there also has to be something that can go from symbols and construct episodes, things that you can imagine in different parts. And that's the hypothesis about what we're finding here. So the brain can combine symbols, and then that can enable us to combine ideas in terms of things that we can actually imagine. There's another story here about the hippocampus and how the brain separates ideas that are similar, but I'll save that for another time. And there's a kind of analogy here with the way different species that live near each other get their markings, but in the interest of time, I'll skip that. I want to sort of close with this idea that, going back to Darwin, that we wouldn't be able to accomplish the things that we accomplished if we weren't able to cooperate, if we didn't have our collective intelligence. And I think our collective intelligence, our social intelligence, comes largely from our emotions, our ability to care about other people, or to be angry at other people when they don't do what they're supposed to do, or to be angry at ourselves, or feel guilty or ashamed if we don't do the things that we're supposed to do. The social is driven by those basic feelings that we share, at least to a large extent, with other animals, although we perhaps experience them in a more elaborate way. But then on the intellectual side and on the individual side, we have these individual powers made possible by language, but I think it's not just about language. It's this ability to flexibly combine ideas and turn them into things that we can imagine and enable us to envision things that we couldn't otherwise, that don't already exist, like a city, right? Or something smaller, like a new invention, right? And I think the essence of human intelligence is this interplay between our social capabilities to work together and our ability as individuals to think of things that have never been thought of before and then spread those ideas to others. But of course, being a very smart primate is a dangerous thing. That is, there's a kind of race between our intellectual ability, our ability to invent new things, whether they're wonderful new things, like the internet, that enable us to have this discussion together on the other, from opposite sides of the world, but also very dangerous things. And we need our social instincts and our feelings to sort of keep up with our intellectual abilities. Otherwise, our intellectual powers may end up undoing our social intelligence, and that, I think, is the great paradox. So I will the great promise and the great paradox. So I'll leave it at that. And Professor Mishra, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions from everybody else. And I'm going to go back to full screen here so we can have a conversation.
Thank you, Professor Greene, for tackling two extremely different things, but they're interconnected, what I could guess, in a short span of time. So I'm not going to ask you the audience's question, because I'm quite sure that they will ask some particular questions. So let me ask some broad questions and maybe some that are related to. So I was wondering, because you were kind of making it obvious that emotional responses are more automatic, and kind of they are the ones that have bound our social evolution, and that is going to help us survive. And I quite agree with you, because I personally also think that if we have got anything in terms of cognitive evolution of the brain, it is the social cognition that kind of has led us to where and how we are tackling the situation that we see now. Social cognition is probably more. But now there is a lot of work in emotion regulation coming from mental cognitive psychology, where the whole idea is this frontoparietal control network can also come in play. You can control your emotional responses in a more analytical, cunning way. So I was just wondering whether you go with the impulse model, or depending on the situation, or whether it is international diplomacy, or it is a household quarrel, or reacting to.
Yeah. So I think you've hit on an important point that I sort of skipped and didn't get to in this talk. But I think that's absolutely right. Is that I think the core of our social behavior are those more automatic responses. But when things get complicated, we need to be able to reason as well. And but I think that reasoning doesn't have any ends of its own, right? So what a simple context in which to think about these things are, delay of gratification, intertemporal choice, right? You can have if you're dieting, you can have the delicious chocolate cake right now. It will be very gratifying. Or you can resist that temptation and be healthier, down the road, right? And if we didn't have, so it's the feeling of wanting the chocolate cake that we're fighting. but we wouldn't be motivated to fight it if we didn't also want to be healthier or look better. And those are ultimately coming back to feelings as well. So even the more reasoned or controlled responses that we have are ultimately coming back to some kind of emotional evaluation. But I think you're absolutely right that when we're outside of, the way I think of it is in everyday life, it's pretty good to be guided by your intuitions. At least if you live in a nice community where people tend to be good to each other, you have good intuitions and you express those. But when we have long-term problems involving risk, and most of all, problems involving groups with different values, with different interests, then we can't all trust our intuitions because we have different intuitions, and they may not be compatible. So I think I agree 100%, and I think it's an excellent and important point.
Yeah, good. So I mean, this remains an open question for neuroscience and both psychological models, and even cultural paradigms to come in and play. The other lingering question, because I edit an international journal with others called International Journal of Cultural Cognitive Science. The name we picked pretty keeping in mind the way the field is developing, the cultural variants or individual differences. So in your work, to what extent you envisage that different cultures or people belonging to different belief structures or different ideologies, they show individual or collective cooperativeness? If that is probably the case, but to what extent empirically, if there is anything that has been done to find these differences? Because considering the situation, find ourselves in the countries and other kinds of people, lots of problems. That's the problem of adaptability, because it's classes of beliefs more than empirical understanding of the world that we are in, but classes of belief structures, the phenomenal side of it that comes to separate us.
I mean, the way I think about this, I think my framework comes from the philosopher Peter Singer, who talks about the expanding circle. And the idea is that all humans, we all exist at the center of a circle. If you're a complete narcissist psychopath and you don't care about anybody else, then you have a very, very small circle. And then if you just care about, only your family or only your close friends, then your circle's a bit smaller. And then if you have a wider community of people that you know and care about, that's a bit bigger. And then you can have people that you know and care about and trust, even if you don't know them personally, people who share your religion or share your nationality or share certain interests that you have, right? And you can expand that to all of humanity, and you could even expand it beyond to caring about animals and their welfare, right? And I think that the most important individual differences, at least in understanding what's going on in the United States, maybe India as well, is people vary in how big their circles are. For the people who support President Trump, I think their circle is relatively small. That is, they really value white Christian Americans, and everybody else is on the outside and not to be trusted, right? And then the political opposition, the more liberal side represented by the Democratic Party, Barack Obama being the most famous example, has a much wider circle. It's more inclusive. It's more welcoming. It's saying America is not about a particular race or a particular religion. America is about a set of ideals that are universal. And so a lot of what I've been thinking about in recent years is the cultural and moral conflict between the Republican and the Democratic Party that's been tearing at America for a long time, but most visibly in the last few years and especially the last few months. And I think that, to get back to your question of, how do cultures and how do individuals differ, if I had to point to one thing where there's differences that has the biggest effects, it's how big is your circle? Who do you care about? Who do you trust? Who are you willing to sacrifice something for if their well-being depends on it?
Yeah, I mean, touching on this, the American situation is obvious, and it has deteriorated with the the recent happenings alongside coronavirus, but the growing nationalism in many countries, like the changes in Poland and uh, not to talk of other countries in Brazil and so on and so forth. And when the pandemic is on, the very same things are not disappearing because they are fighting actually multiple wars. So it's so what exactly is binding these people to remain solitary and think of as if they're going to be okay? Uh, that is
Yeah.
some confidence I see at a at a different level, and this whole emphasis on let's do our own stuff and get back to our own civilizational values and culture and etc. And it
Yeah.
will be okay. So that is a very strange feeling, considering the amount of work has been done on
Yeah.
international, like 100 years at least. And when two wars have been fought, and the Cold
Yeah.
War, the later more opening up of values and migration of people. So
Right.
it's a I would you like to, because you brought in the American context. So in
Yeah.
India, a lot to talk about, but I want to get into that in such
Yeah.
time though.
Well, I think in the United States, it has a lot to do with economics over the last 50 years. That is, if you look at the basics of the American economy in the 20th century, after World War II, GDP, the size of the American economic pie got bigger and bigger and bigger. And the typical person's slice of the pie, so median income, got bigger and bigger as well. Those two things got bigger together. And then, depending on how you measure it, starting in the 70s, 80s, 90s, these things started coming apart, where the pie got bigger and bigger and bigger, but a typical person's slice of it was not getting bigger. And in fact, for people who didn't have as much education, it got smaller in terms of real money. And basically, it's a story of inequality. And the reason why cooperation works, the reason why you can have a larger and larger circle, is if the benefits of cooperation are distributed, right? That you feel like you're part of the team and you're willing to sacrifice for the team and you're willing to trust the team if the team includes you in the benefit and not just in the cost, right? And what happened over the last 30, 40 years in the United States is, during the 20th century, the United States was in this wonderful position of, wonderful for the United States, of reaping the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. That we built highways and we built before that railroads, and we were ahead in using electricity and all of these things that made it possible for the United States to be leaders in production and selling to the world and keeping that going with education and so on. And then the rest of the world started catching up and it became cheaper to build things elsewhere, right? And not only that, as technology progressed, people who had more and more specialized knowledge were able to make more and more money, and then use their money in order to buy political influence to secure that. And so we just get this spreading, right? And I think what happened with a lot of Americans is they felt like the social contract was broken, that they kept working hard and doing their best, but they weren't getting the benefits that they expected. They weren't doing as well as their parents did. And that created this opening for someone like Trump to say, you know what, forget the rest of the world. You first. People, you and the people who look like you, they should be coming first. And it's been a very powerful message. And if the Democrats come back into power, I think the first thing that they need to do is reset that balance and figure out how to rewrite the social contract in a way that benefits everybody in the U.S. and hopefully not just the U.S. but mindful of the wider world.
Uh, yeah, I mean, it would be pretty interesting to see what kind of an election you will have, considering what situation we find ourselves. It will be really interesting. So now coming back to some questions, thinking of public good. You may be following that the new restrictions. I mean, the coronavirus restrictions in different countries. There is some rebel people are opposing. Like in Germany, there is almost a political party that is coming to power, telling people that we will assure that you are free, even if the coronavirus is on. And in India, there is some kind of a passive aggression that this curtailing my freedom or wearing a mask is, but wearing a mask is for others' good, as far as I understand it. So if people think individually that I am disease free, so why should I be wearing a mask? But probably two-way traffic, and this is not sinking in, and that therefore we see a lot of people in a couple of countries. And more recently, the news was that the Germans have gotten on a plane and have gone to the usual summer resort in Spain. So it is being treated as a sign of narcissism, even if the world is burning, you are thinking of your own happiness. And although all the are on, but who knows? Your protections are going to cost other people. They still have not gotten over. Like Spence still has not gotten over. So how do you see in actual real life situation people really balancing what they can do themselves and which is actually for others?
In the US, it actually, I think, comes back to the stuff we were just talking about, that the split between the people who think, of course I need to wear a mask, and the people who don't, the best predictor is politics. And I think it really comes back to trust. That is, do you trust in the system? Do you think that, that this is a society in which if you follow the rules, good things happen, right? Or do you resent the system and you feel you don't trust it, and what the experts say is just someone's playing their games with you, right? And so I think it's that I think is a really nice example of a very visible activity that sort of expresses this difference in people's psychology. But I think it really comes down to those social feelings and whether or not you feel like this message that says wear a mask, is it coming from within your group or from outside your group? Is it outside your circle or inside?
It's more self-awareness as opposed to government telling you, and there is a feeling of opposing, given our liberal tendencies, that many people don't like to be told. But the situation is that we don't know really. So they know the facts. So now they're coming to a little bit of a autobiographical question. To what extent Peter Singer was an influence in driving you towards the question of morality and ethics?
I mean, he's been an influence and an inspiration for a long time. Early on, even when I was in high school, I started thinking about, well, there are people in the world who are much worse off than I am. How can I justify spending money on personal luxuries for myself, when that money could do much more good for somebody else? And then I realized that, Peter Singer had this idea a long, long time ago and had really thought it through. And so that brought me to his work. And more recently, I've actually come back to doing work that's very related to what he's doing. And we actually have a collaborative research project now. We have a paper that just came out looking at the difference between emotional appeals and rational appeals for charity, in particular for getting people to give money to the effective charities that are able to actually promote global health with relatively small amounts of money compared to other organizations. But almost everything that I'm interested in ethics has really been he's been way ahead in terms of pointing to the things that really matter and providing a framework for how to think about them.
Well, two more questions and they will be quick. So while you were talking about the compositionality, the binding power of language in spatiotemporal sense, which is a very wonderful framework because it brings together, I was sensing a lot of embodied simulation-based theories, as language is basically a gluing mechanism. And I was thinking of people like Zagendorf and Barbara Landau and others who have brought in some non-mainstream ideas and which are now being popular. But I was thinking of Albert Costa, who was a close friend and who did a lot of work on bilingualism, who was a postdoc at Harvard working with Alfonso Caramazza, but who unfortunately expired a year ago. And his last visit was to Goa, which I hosted, and I had an interview with him, which is available on our website. Albert Costa was beginning to look at the power of language on moral decision making, particularly for.
I know that work.
And you may be aware of that. So I mean, it was just coming into me. So of course, the computational side is one thing, what language does. in terms of going around, but the language that people are using in real life situation is altering the way they would like to take a decision.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think it's a nice case. So what Costa found, at least in the work that I'm familiar with, is you give people moral dilemmas where you can push somebody off the footbridge in order to save 5 lives, and it's this very violent action, but it does a lot of good, and so it feels bad, but you know that it'll save more lives, right? So there's this fast versus slow tension between the feeling and the reasoning. And what he showed is that in your second language, you're more likely to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. And the idea is that you read the words and it doesn't have the reasoning is the same, but the emotional response isn't the same. It's kind of like hearing swear words, bad words in a different language. It doesn't have the same impact as the ones that you grew up with, right? And I think that this nicely illustrates the difference between the more formal, cold, symbolic side of our thinking and then the more affective side as well. That is, in terms of the conceptual structure, you're representing the same ideas, but when you use your first language rather than your second language, the emotional pieces that go along with it are stronger, and that can change the balance in the decision making.
Yeah, the last question, and this is a bit methodological, because I too sometimes have that problem, because you are a true multidisciplinary worker, and it shows up your acceptance of neuroimaging methods, concepts from philosophy and cognitive psychological methods. But as you may know, these fields have their own problems, and they sometimes get addressed in terms of special issues, whether they really are close, if it is truly multidisciplinary, or if it is many disciplines that are doing their own stuff, and then when we have to speak, we just put a multidisciplinary tag and we just portray ourselves as cognitive scientists. So there is some kind of like recently Bernard Hommel, whom we are going to have on this channel next, has written that this cognitive psychology is functionalist, mechanistic, and it doesn't have the subjective touch of William James and other people. So I too agree sometimes. To what extent you have found this conflict, even when you have been trying very hard to blend together and do laboratory-based work? Or has it ever created a conflict in your philosophical way of looking, as opposed to what cognitive psychologists do every day? They're very paradigm attached, and the limitations of neuroimaging, because there are many books, the new phrenology and the brain pictures don't tell us much. That kind of stuff is well there. So how have you been able to pull all this together, and how?
Right. Well, so I guess there are sort of really two contrasts there. One is neuroimaging compared to other methods for studying the human mind and brain, right? And then there's the scientific approach versus maybe a more humanistic approach that can be more emotionally satisfying in some ways. When it comes to neuroimaging, I think it's a mix. There you get these extreme views that say, "Oh, we've learned nothing; it's useless, new phrenology," and then people who are very enthusiastic. I think there have been some disappointments. I would have, if you asked me 20 years ago when I was just starting to do this, what do I think? How much more would we know in 20 years? I think we haven't learned as much as I would have hoped in 20 years, right? When I started, that is, and I think that's kind of a limitation of the fact that we're tracking blood flow, and it's a pretty coarse-grained signal, and we didn't know how much we'd be able to do with it and how much better the technology would get, and the technology just didn't get that much better. At the same time, I actually think that a lot of more recent neuroimaging work is really interesting, because this is some of the work I described as examples of this, that instead of just looking at activation, oh, this is going up or this is going down, and so we're saying this part of the brain is involved in this activity, we can actually look at these more subtle patterns and see content, the difference between dog and cat, and understand something about the process. So, for example, in the work I described, we use neuroimaging to understand something like the brain is doing this in a more computer-like way, representing these different variables in these different populations of neurons. That's something that I don't think we could have learned from behavioral studies or using older methods. So I think that we haven't learned as much maybe as we hoped, but I still think we're learning new things, and that it's a little harder to understand, and it's a little more complicated as the methods have gotten more involved. But I still think we're making good progress. And then I guess when it comes to sort of a more humanistic approach versus a more scientific approach, um, I get impatient. I think like everybody else, I have ideas that I would love to be able to test that we just don't have the ability to. And I'm comfortable speculating and saying, well, maybe it's like this, maybe it's like that, in ways that some good scientists are not, that you're never supposed to say anything or think anything that goes too far beyond the data that we have. But mostly I feel like I've just been really lucky. That is, I started out as a philosopher, and I was able to get in a position where I can use the tools of science to try to answer some of these questions. And so overall, my work has shifted away from the neuroscience of morality, and I've tried to use neuroscience where I think it can tell us the most, which is about these questions about language and thought. And then my work in morality has focused more on behavioral research, which I didn't talk about much today, but I did a little bit. So, you evolve and you adapt and see what your tools do well and what they don't do as well. But I don't know. I'm overall optimistic, but that's as much a matter of personal temperament as it is objective facts about the state of the science.
Yeah.
So.
I think that's it from me, and over to Seema. Thank you very much for answering and elaborating the questions. And let's have some questions from the audience.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, so we have a few questions that have come in. I want to start with a question of my own. To what extent do you think the social instincts are flexible? Can they be changed or trained in some way? And also, is that something that's necessary for cooperation? Because if different people are sticking with their own moral values in a rigid manner, how do you even reach a common ground?
Yeah. So I think that our emotions are flexible, but they change relatively slowly. That our emotions don't just change on a dime. It requires training and habits, right? And this is, I think Aristotle got things right, that, that you don't just think something and you're different. You really have to sort of build your moral life, and at the collective level, build a moral culture through habit, through practices, right? And I think it's very important for learning to live with people who might be different from you. That if you live in a world where everybody's just like you, or everything's the way it has always been, then your feelings will be okay. They'll be good guides, right? Or at least but when the world changes, when new people, new groups come together, yeah, our feelings need to adapt, and I wish we could speed it up. And part of the work that I'm doing now is trying to figure out how do you change people's feelings in a constructive way relatively quickly. We're starting to do some experiments where we have people with different political views cooperating together, and what we find is that the cooperative process pretty quickly changes people's feelings, or at least makes progress.
So I'll start taking the questions. Akshay Dikshit is asking, how much do you think curiosity drives cooperative behavior? Because there will always be a clash between individuals with a spectrum of uncertain rewards.
Well, I think curiosity plays a role in almost any kind of decision making that involves uncertainty, right? That there's always do I do what's worked in the past, or do I try something new, right? And so, even if you're not, forget about social behavior. If you're just an animal that's looking for food, you could say, well, I could go look for food where I found it before, or I could go look someplace else and maybe I'll find something better, or maybe I'll find nothing, right? But you have to sort of take that risk. And so I think curiosity is not only important for social behavior, but it's important for everything we do where there isn't a formula, and where there are unknown unknowns, right?
Okay. Um, Suraj is asking, can you share some thoughts over the temporal aspects of meaning formation by the brain? Additionally, what are your views on time and critical judgments relationship? For example, when participants take 10 seconds time to respond, they make different sets of judgments. Can you highlight the issue a little bit more?
Oh gosh, this is a good question. I mean, I think the answer is I don't really know very much. We haven't looked at timing very much when it comes to the work on complex thought, other than just to say that it happens very quickly in the sense of, you understand a sentence within a second or two, right? So, that's not a discovery, that's just something in the background, but I think it's an important fact. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, but I don't have anything, unfortunately, I don't have anything new to say about it. Yeah.
Akshay is asking again,
Yeah.
just like we have 360-degree cameras, which can be considered a form of collective artificial intelligence, how can the
Mhm.
same thing be monitored in humans, especially in a lab setting using vision science? Will the collective field of view of multiple individuals form a collective
Yeah.
intelligence?
Well, I think in some sense that's what empathy is, right? Is that it gives you on an emotional level a broader perspective, right? That you're talking about having a wider field of view visually, empathy and learning to sort of put yourself in somebody else's shoes, think somebody else's thoughts. That is the social emotional equivalent of taking your blinders off and having a wider field of vision.
Shivam Puri is asking, is it possible to instill collective cooperative behavior in people by subliminally priming trust using smartphones, PCs, etc. via social media platforms?
Um, I think it's worth trying, but probably not. I think that I mean, well, you need a lot of excuse me. I think that subliminal effects are very weak. They're just little fleeting nudges, right? And the stuff that really has a big effect on us are the things that we experience and the things that we can imagine. And you can hear a sound and have that register unconsciously, or you see a picture for a few milliseconds, and that can give you a you see a picture of a shark with scary teeth, and but you only see it unconsciously, and for a moment you feel a little scared and you don't know why. But you can't imagine a whole scene unconsciously, right? And so I think that I find this kind of work very interesting in terms of understanding things like what is consciousness for, and what can you do unconsciously, and what do you need consciousness for. So I like that kind of research, but I think that big changes are not going to happen through little flittering unconscious stimuli. That's I mean, it's an empirical question, but that's my guess.
Okay, Abir is asking, Professor Greene, what do you think drives the march on streets in America? I mean, were people really driven by their intuitions
Yeah.
towards what happened consequently? Or this was their emotional response? Or is it the case that they were first driven by that single case and now they're totally systemized and politicized?
Yeah. I
What
mean,
was
I don't think I have anything very original to say here, but I think the George Floyd video just eliminated all the ambiguity, all of the excuses that you could possibly make, right? If it was a case where something happened very quickly and there was a split-second decision or something like that, or if the police said, well, the person was fighting back, all of the excuses, all of the things. And not only that, because I think it was important that there were several police officers, right? It wasn't just that Chauvin, the man who murdered him, did it. Is the other three officers standing by. And they may not have approved of what he was doing, but they didn't feel like they could stop him. And that tells you that it's not just a bad apple. It's not just an individual problem. It tells you that it was a problem with the culture, right? That you know, the murderer thought he could get away with it, and the people around him let him get away with it. And all of those things combined, and the fact that you could just see it with your own eyes for 8 minutes, just made people realize, okay, this all we enough excuses. We can't find a way to rationalize this. This should never ever happen. And the fact that this could happen means that there's something wrong with the system. That it's the problems at a cultural level and not an individual level. And I think that that got through in a way that it hadn't gotten through before, at least to many people.
That's it with the questions. We have a comment. Okay, I think there's one more question. So, sorry. So Vaishnavi is asking, we often have to take quick decisions that involve a complex combination of emotional and logical components. And the choice might not directly involve self-interest or societal interest, rather a combination of the two. In this case, is there a combinational representation in the brain that we choose from? Basically,
Yeah,
how
well,
do
I
we
think,
choose?
In general, you know, we can say, be a bit more specific about this, that when there are two competing alternatives, both are represented in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that is representing the value of different options and weighing them against each other. And that, I think, is exactly what happens in those kinds of situations. And we see it with the sorts of moral dilemmas that I studied for years with, you know, killing one to save five. That trade-off is taking place in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And I think in general, it seems like whenever there are competing options to be weighed, there's a real, you know, you can, it's not just that we know it's taking place, but we can actually say more about the physical process and the way that that computation works.
Actually, a quick follow-up to that. So how do we know when we need to rely on our gut reactions and when we need to fall back on the more deliberative process?
Well, so I guess I have a general rule of thumb that is, when you're dealing with everyday life, when you're dealing with familiar situations, it's probably okay to rely on your gut reactions. But when you're dealing with other people who are not part of your group, who don't share your values or don't have the same interests as yours, that's when you can't trust your intuitions as much, because they have their own intuitions and you can't both have the right intuitions. And so you need to sort of step out of the intuitive mindset and try to think, okay, well, what are our goals? How do we find a path forward that will produce good consequences for both of us?
Okay, the next question is by Amit. He's asking, do you think that a theory like Gestalt, which considers the perception to be holistic as opposed to the structural analysis, would in any way be helpful in interpreting the physiological data about conceptual combination during language processing?
I'm sure the answer is yes. I don't know. I think there's a mapping between those two types of ways of thinking about vision, for example, and the distinction between, you know, representing a sentence as symbolic parts that have been combined versus a more holistic imagined event. And so in some sense, that distinction is already part of what I've talked about, but I'm sure there's more to it than that, but I don't think I have anything new to add there as well, beyond what I just said. Yeah.
I think we can end the Q&A session now. It's also getting close to the time that we had decided.
Yeah. Okay.
Any final thoughts, Professor Greene and Professor Mishra?
Just to say that I really appreciate the invitation. It's wonderful to meet you and to get a chance to talk and to have this conversation. So thanks so much to both of you for the honor and the opportunity. And I hope to visit India someday and meet you in person, or see you here in the United States or someplace else.
Yeah, I mean, it's our pleasure, and I again would say that you already acceptance of and being the first inaugural speaker, has been totally a nice thing, and I assume that a lot of people who are watching or will watch on YouTube will benefit. And we could focus on a lot of things, some contemporary, some from actual research. And I encourage people to go and look up the books and the articles, and if they have questions, they can always follow it up. So I think it's pretty late at night there in Boston, and thank you very much. And we have a cloudy day here, and it's looking like it stays like that in Hyderabad. It's monsoon in India. So thank you, Seema, for being a good moderator and helping around with a lot of, even in online form, we have logistic issues, which I am realizing people actually. So it has its own culture, which we have to adopt fast. But it went well, and thank you very much. So from our side, and I too wish if situation, I hope that international travel begins, and it would be nice to meet you and talk to you at Harvard. And we extend an invitation for your physical appearance anytime when things become normal and travel worthy. And we collectively aim for that or hope for that. Not in very near future, but sometimes maybe later next year.
All right.
So thank you and good night.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. Just a quick sort of a notice. As Professor Mishra said, this is a series of talks. So the next talk will be on July 14th. This is to all the people who are attending it. Please keep an eye on the official Facebook page of University of Hyderabad for updates.
Is our next speaker.
Yeah, I'm saying. So the next speaker is, there are two speakers. It's Professor Thomas Wynn and Professor Frederick Coolidge, who are pioneers in the area of cognitive anthropology and cognitive archaeology. So they're going to be talking about how to use tools from archaeology to understand evolution of cognitive system. So that also promises to be a very exciting session.
Yeah.
Just one sentence from me. It's very intuitively we are bringing in people that really have advanced our knowledge in fields that traditionally are not taught in structured cognitive science programs like cognitive archaeology or neuroarchaeology, and the question of morality. While consciousness gets debated and talked, but not certainly morality and the kind of issues that Professor Greene has written about. So this remains one of the aims of this program, and we will pursue that. And we are quite sure that we will get important scholars to talk to us. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, and have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Take care. Have a good day.
Bye. Bye-bye.